before he does anything, he checks his plans with God. Do I get this right? You know, somebody who thinks they're a leader and nobody's following, they're just taking a walk. So he wants to make sure that if God's calling him to lead, God is with him and it is the right direction. So he calls on God. He gets sure that his instructions are correct. And then he starts to plan his steps. Now, Nehemiah is a cupbearer. What's a cupbearer? He wasn't into contracting. He didn't do construction. He was an educated man, but he was a cupbearer, which means he served the king his wine. Doesn't sound like too bad of a job. His purpose was to drink the wine first. And if he died, the king would say, I'll just pass on that one. Give me another bottle. You better give me another cupbearer, too. That one's done like toast. So that was Nehemiah's job, was to see if the king's wine was poisoned. So he goes from checking to see if stuff was poisoned to a huge project. But he wasn't asked to do the project. He was asked to start. And that's where we start. He says, Lord of heaven, I'm just going to paraphrase this. He starts praying, you're an awesome God. Would you listen to me? Give attention. Listen to my heart. You put this in there, and then he starts. He says, look, we need to confess our sins. We're down here in captivity because we sinned. I am where I am because we did what we did, and you had told us that if we sin, we would be here. We acted wickedly towards you. He's acknowledging that he isn't where he should be because of the sin of the people. But then he says, remember your promises to us. Remember what you said you would do through us. We are to bring honor to you throughout the world. And grant me the favor so that I can execute your promise. And then he asks God to give favor of the king's opinion towards him, so that when he walks in, rather than saying, that's a little presumptuous, I think we should kill you, instead of that, he wants God to have him come into the king's presence and say, what is it that you want to talk to me about? So he gets God to work on the heart of the king, and he takes the first step. And he goes before the king, and he says, King, thank you for asking. I know this sounds crazy, but would you grace me with permission to leave? I need to go, from Susa, I need to go 850 miles back to Jerusalem, and I need permission to rebuild the walls and to redeem the reputation of our God. Now, this is a foreign king, and you're asking permission to go and rebuild another kingdom. That's not a popular request. But with God going ahead of him and speaking to the king's heart, the king not only did what Nehemiah asked, he provisioned him, supplied him, protected him, and sent him up with a caravan. God did what he promised to us in the New Testament, to go amazingly above and beyond anything you could think. I don't think that Nehemiah went in there thinking that he is going to send a caravan with me. He just was trying not to get killed. So that his first step was small, and all he needed to do was make his request to God and not get killed. So he started small. And I think that sometimes we stumble into this stopping us. Because we look at where it could go, how big it could get, how complicated it might be, and we don't put into that perspective the fact that we don't need to have the faith to finish. We just have to have the faith to start. You just need to start. How do you start something big? Let me qualify big. you heard Yarrow here a couple of years ago. She was a social worker, and she kept running into girls coming out of human trafficking. And there was nothing in Lee County. And by the way, we have reached the noble position of number 2 in the United States for human trafficking insults. But Yarrow said, this is not right. Somebody must do something. And she was so impressed that she did something. And she started to take small steps. And she was working full-time as a social worker, and she was working with human trafficking to try to get it stopped. And she started a very small movement, which quickly burgeoned and got totally out of her control because it got large. And so it went from there to a board of directors and a group of volunteers. And those of you who were with us at the banquet the other night, the Attorney General was there, the state prosecutors, the county prosecutors, the sheriff. There was 3 sheriff departments. There was the city chiefs. And it went from one lady working in, one young girl, she's in her 20s. She just said, this is not right. Somebody's got to do something. And she started. And now it's evolved until they have a specialist, a grant writer, so that the government funds it. And from this one girl taking the first step, which is to help 1 or 2 girls, it is becoming a statewide agency for the government to fund help to girls and boys who are caught in human trafficking. If you'd have looked at how complicated it was going to get, you'd have never started. But you're not asked to solve that complication. You're just helped to you're just asked to help one girl start. She didn't let the faith to start stop her, and it evolved on its own. Huge movement started by a 20-something-year-old girl who just could not stand to see women being taken advantage of. So, how do you do something large? In your insert, you do something large, you start small. Look, I think that we see so many examples of success that we almost are afraid to start a humble start. You know what I mean? You start a church, and you got 30 people sitting around the living room, and you turn on the television, and there's someone with 50,000 people in the church. God didn't tell you to worry about that. You couldn't handle his nightmares and stress anyways. Just, you got 30 people, start where you are. Start small. And now this is the one. Read this with me. This is so good. Read this with me. Do not despise these small beginnings. Why? For the Lord rejoices. See, the work begun. You know, any of you see your baby's first steps? Did you? Let me see. How many? Did you? Let me see. Okay. Linda's not here, so I can say this. She didn't. She was working. Now, we traveled in a band, and we'd been together for all total, 20 years, something like that. And we were a very close-knit family. So she was working, had a very good job. And the band member who we traveled with, and we just, 7 days a week we were together. We were like an extended family, except that Erin took her first steps while Linda was at work. And Marilyn phoned Linda and said, you wouldn't believe that your baby just took the first steps. Oh, it's so exciting. Linda resigned that day. She didn't ask me. She didn't consult. Why? These first steps to watch the baby start. What is it? It's called the drunken Frankenstein, where the baby's kind of... And those first steps, you just flip out. You can be a sophisticated parent. But when that baby takes that first drunken Frankenstein walk, you're just freaking out. Why? It's so exciting. God says when you start, that's exciting. It's wobbly. It's not stable. It doesn't have any particular direction. But it says God rejoices when we start small. How do you start something large? You start small. And when the baby falls, and they will, they always do. And usually they're wearing diapers and it goes, unless there's something in them. But anyways, they fall. And what do you say? Stupid kid? No. You pick them up and you encourage them and you get them to take more Frankenstein steps. In fact, you run for the recorder and you videotape it to show at their wedding. All right. It's so exciting to watch first steps. And when God lays something on your heart, you don't worry about the end product. All you do is take the first steps. You don't need faith to finish. You just need the faith to start. Somebody is struggling with something about starting, and God is looking for people who do the Frankenstein walk, who will start wobbly, and he will cheer you on. In the Nehemiah story, he had a burden to build the wall, and Ezra had been trying to do it for years, and they were still in ruins. Nothing had happened. It was disorganized. They were all discouraged, and you can look at the end product. It was a magnificent wall. It was an unbelievable project, and you can look at the success of the ending, but you should not forget that it started with Nehemiah talking to God, talking to the king, then packing his toothbrush. That's all he was asked to do. Pack your toothbrush, jump on the donkey, ride 850 miles. And when he got there, he stopped for 3 days. If I'd have been on a donkey for 800 miles, I'd have stopped and sat down for 3 days too. And then secretly, he surveyed the site at night. He made his plan. You only have to take one step at a time. You have to take the faith to start. And so now he's assessed the situation. He's got back to Jerusalem. He's looking around, does a circumnavigation at night, and he's going, oh, this is a mess. And now the next step he's got to take, and he has to encourage discouraged people who don't necessarily want to build a wall. Why? They're subsistence farming. They're trying to make a living. Why don't you take 2 weeks off work and come and paint the church? You've got to be nuts. 2 weeks will put me under. Well, 2 weeks would starve them to death. Are you with me? He's got to figure out how to encourage and discourage people who don't necessarily see building a city wall as a top priority. And one of the things that happens when we start is the synergy between the direction and the power of God begins to interact. You think, I got to do this, I got to do that. Get over yourself. Let God work. You just take the steps and you let God provide both the direction and the energy to see that it gets done. So he's talking to the people after he surveyed the city, and he says, you see the trouble we're in? No kidding. Jerusalem lies in ruins. The gates have been burned with fire. Come, let's rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. The kings did that to disgrace them. When the walls are down, you have no protection. You can't hide wealth. You're just easy picking for any marauding group that goes by. And we will no longer be in disgrace. I also told them about the gracious hand of my God on me. In other words, God has started to do something here. And he said, let's continue what God has started. And the people said, let's start rebuilding. And so they began the good work. They didn't have to do everything. They just had to lay the first stone and get started. Now, we said what happens. When you start, you feel God calling you. Then you have uncertainty. So he went and talked to God, and then after he resolved the uncertainty and prayed about it, the third thing last week we said that happens is predictable resistance. Are you right with me? Remember this last week? I know, you hang on every word I said. This is on your refrigerator. You'll never forget this. First, God calls us. Second, there's some ambiguity and uncertainty. And thirdly, comes opposition. And hard times don't mean you're outside of the will of God. Sometimes hard time mean finally you're doing something large enough and challenging enough that you've awakened Satan, and he's afraid of what you're about to do. Good things are about to happen. If you don't have resistance, I would say you need to check and make sure that it's big enough. We're not worried about what you can do. We're not worried about what you can do. We're only worried about you being faithful so God can work through you. It's the power of God which accomplishes these things. So we are responsible for starting and taking the next step. All of these things are predictable. Resistance is predictable. And here comes these three wonderful guys. So we're responsible on the back page to take the next step. That's all you got to do is take the next step. When Sanballat the Horite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab heard about it, they mocked and ridiculed us. What is this you're doing? Are you rebelling against the king? Which would have got them killed. I answered them by saying, the God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start. Nehemiah didn't say, come in here and I'll whip your butt. He said, this is a God project. This is God of heaven doing something here. You're not taking on me. I'm working for God. And so he acknowledged that he was what? Just a servant, serving the Most High God. See, he had taken the small step, and then he took the next step, and then he took the next step, and then he took the next step. And I think that we are all called at times to do stuff. Anybody in here buy a house? Yeah. You're not asked to pay for the whole thing, but you are asked for a down payment. It's really nice. And then the bank owns you for 50 years. But anyways, you are just asked to take the first step. I think about some of the things we're doing now. I have wanted to for years and years and years. How do we get the word out? And I don't really understand a lot of it, and I feel somewhat exposed about it. We started, Eric stuck a phone up and started broadcasting the services. And I got thinking, that's what I've been trying to do all along. Finally, God says, you're so stupid, let me help you. So I don't know where this will go. I only know that you took the first step. We've had up to 600 people now. It's fallen off, and we're going to leave it off. Why? Because we don't know what we're doing. So we're learning right now. Juice and John are working on how do we, right now the sound isn't good enough. And I noticed that in the picture I was awful small. So we're in the process of learning for the people who do look on it, how do you allow them to hear the message? And we looked at that stupid thing. There's people in Canada and all over the place watching this service. We've taken the first step. Now, what's the next one? What's the next one? I don't have to worry about the end result. I don't have to have the faith to finish. I just have to have the faith to take the next step. And you know as well as I do, there are pastors who are more, and don't stutter, who speak more eloquently and are more presentable and don't have microphones hanging around their neck. But I don't care. I only know that this is what we're going to do, is take the next step. And so he is out ahead of us. In fact, if you move too slow, he'll get someone to stick a camera up and start you whether you want to or not. So what is it that we do? We just take the next step. We figured out next week we will be hooking up the camera so that we get better sound live while we're playing along, and people can hear us more clearly. And I've been reading about how it's done, and I don't have to reinvent the wheel. So we take the first step, then we take the next step. What's the next step? The next step is getting people so they can hear me. Maybe that's why there were so many people watching it. They didn't understand a word that I was saying. But now we're going to see if they will both hear. So take another step, another step, another step. You are being necessary to take the first step. What is it? Maybe you want to lose 20 pounds. What's the first step? Put the first step on the treadmill. What's the second step? The second step on the treadmill. What's the third step? Push back against a brownie. Give it to your pastor. So what steps do you have to take? You have to take the next step. And it's not a big one. It's just a small one, but take it. And step after step after step. I don't know where this other thing's going. I just know that we are being pushed to do something. Why would he do this to me? I don't even know what I'm saying sometimes. And yet, apparently, all the eloquent pastors are busy. So, now, what are you being challenged to do? It's called a divine inspiration. What is in your heart? Where are you being pushed? I find that quite often when I talk to people, they've got something they've been struggling about doing for quite a while. They know they should be doing it. They feel the impression they don't know where to start. This morning, God's message is you take the first step. And then what do? You take the second step. Maybe you've just come through a difficult situation and God is saying, use that to help others. Help my children. Maybe I have no idea what God's calling you to do. I'm here to say, take the first step. Then expect some uncertainty. Then expect some opposition. And then expect unbelievable confidence as you start to serve God. Now, don't ever let the start stop you. There are many big things to do. And in the end, he built the wall in 52 days. And no longer could marauders come in, but at night they could go inside, close the walls, and the city of Jerusalem was secured in 52 days. The opposition was so intense that sometimes they had to have a trowel in one hand and a sword in the other. Expect opposition, but take the step anyways. If you don't have opposition, I worry. Move in the direction God tells you. One last thing. When they built the wall, they weren't done. They had to build the temple. Then they had to return to the worship of God. Then they had to build a culture of holiness before God. And so they took the step. They had a huge accomplishment, and then God gave them another step. And then, look, you and I are building the kingdom. He will be building the kingdom through us until he comes again. It doesn't matter what you're doing. Take the next step. And if you get it all done, you get to stand back and look at it and say, thank you, God, I never could have done that. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And he say, oh, by the way, I need you to do something else for my kingdom. You don't retire from the kingdom. He's building it, and he will until the sky rips in two, and he comes streaming through with 10,000 groups of 10,000 angels. And then your work is done, and your reward begins.